The Mexican-American War, often celebrated in traditional accounts as a pivotal chapter in the United States' westward expansion, was in reality driven by a convergence of economic imperatives and political ambitions deeply rooted in the nation's growing capitalist structure. This was not merely a spontaneous call to fulfill manifest destiny, but a calculated move to secure the territorial and economic growth that would bolster the United States' burgeoning power on the global stage. In the decades leading up to the war, the southern states of the U.S., heavily reliant on plantation economies and slavery, faced pressures to expand their reach. The fertile lands of Texas, already a contested space following its independence from Mexico, represented an opportunity to extend the institution of slavery and sustain the economic systems that underpinned Southern wealth. The annexation of Texas, followed by war with Mexico, was a deliberate strategy to align economic expansion with political power. At the same time, the northern industrial economy stood to gain from new markets and raw materials in the western territories. The acquisition of California, with its promising ports and proximity to Pacific trade routes, became a strategic priority. Politicians and businessmen alike envisioned the expansion as a means to solidify the United States as an emerging economic power, one capable of rivaling European nations in trade and influence. The Polk administration played a central role in shaping this expansionist agenda. President James K. Polk's focus on territorial acquisition was unapologetically aggressive, as evidenced by his maneuvering to provoke conflict with Mexico. The disputed border between Texas and Mexico provided the perfect pretext for war. Polk's insistence on U.S. claims to the Rio Grande, as Texas's southern boundary disregarded Mexican sovereignty and exploited the ambiguity surrounding Texas's contested borders. Yet, this expansionist ambition was not without domestic dissent. Critics like Abraham Lincoln, then a congressman, questioned the morality and legitimacy of waging war against Mexico. They argued that the war served the interests of a select elite, Southern slaveholders, Northern industrialists, and political leaders eager for territorial dominance, at the expense of ordinary Americans who bore the cost of conflict. This war exemplifies the economic calculus underlying many of the United States' territorial expansions. Far from a noble crusade for liberty, it was a conflict designed to secure the economic resources and geopolitical positioning necessary to propel the U.S. into a new phase of growth. The human costs and ethical compromises, while visible to contemporaries, were often overshadowed by the triumphant narrative of national destiny and progress. The Mexican-American War was as much a battle of narratives as it was a military conflict. Central to the success of this war was the role of propaganda in manufacturing consent and shaping public opinion. Through the use of rhetoric and patriotic fervor, the U.S. government and sympathetic media outlets framed the conflict not as a war of conquest but as a righteous defense of American values and destiny. Newspapers, a primary medium of the time, played an instrumental role in disseminating this message. Editors and publishers, often aligned with expansionist ideologies, painted Mexico as a weak and uncivilized nation incapable of governing its vast territories. This characterization allowed the United States to cast itself as a benevolent force, bringing order and progress to lands seen as underutilized or mismanaged. Terms like civilization and freedom were wielded to mask the economic and political motives underpinning the war. President James K. Polk, a masterful manipulator of public perception, capitalized on these narratives. His administration skillfully used incidents like the disputed skirmish on the Rio Grande to portray Mexico as the aggressor. By framing the clash as an unprovoked attack on American soil, Polk secured congressional support and rallied public opinion around what he described as a necessary act of self-defense. Critics who questioned the legitimacy of the war were often dismissed as unpatriotic or unsupportive of American soldiers. This propaganda effort extended beyond media and politics. Clergy members, civic leaders, and even school textbooks echoed the narrative of manifest destiny, presenting the war as part of God's plan for America's expansion. This religious and moral framing added a layer of inevitability to the conflict, making dissent not only politically risky but morally suspect. Yet, despite the pervasiveness of pro-war propaganda, resistance persisted. Abolitionists, intellectuals, and some politicians exposed the stark contradictions in the official narrative. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Henry David Thoreau highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation claiming to spread liberty while perpetuating slavery and dispossessing indigenous and Mexican peoples. The war's propaganda machine reflects the broader dynamics of power, where narratives are wielded as tools to legitimize actions that serve the interests of the elite. The carefully curated image of a righteous war against tyranny cloaked the more material motivations driving the conflict, leaving a legacy of contested memory in the annals of U.S. history. The Mexican-American War, often romanticized in traditional narratives, exacted a grim toll on those caught in its grasp. The human cost, layered with profound inequalities, reveals a starkly different picture of conquest and expansion than the heroic myths suggest. From soldiers and civilians to the displaced and dispossessed, the war left a legacy of suffering and exploitation. For the soldiers, many of whom were poor immigrants or working-class men, the war was marked by harsh conditions and coercion. Recruitment efforts targeted the most vulnerable, including recent Irish and German immigrants, who were promised steady pay and the allure of citizenship. Once enlisted, these men faced grueling marches, inadequate rations, and rampant disease. In fact, more soldiers perished from illness than from combat, a statistic that underscores the grueling and often mismanaged nature of the campaign. Desertion rates soared as soldiers grew disillusioned with the brutal realities of war. Some found themselves questioning the morality of fighting what they saw as a war of aggression, while others simply sought escape from the unbearable hardships. Those who stayed were often subjected to harsh discipline, further exacerbating the inequality between officers who lived relatively comfortably and the rank-and-file soldiers who bore the brunt of the conflict. For Mexican civilians, the war brought devastation on an even greater scale. Towns and villages along the path of U.S. forces were looted, homes destroyed, and lives uprooted. Civilians, already struggling under the economic strains of war, faced displacement and violence as armies clashed. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, often subjected to the collateral violence of the advancing U.S. military. The inequalities extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The war's aftermath entrenched systemic exploitation, as newly annexed territories saw their Mexican inhabitants relegated to second-class status. Land rights were frequently ignored or forcibly stripped, reducing entire communities to economic precarity. The promises of protection under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo often rang hollow, as discrimination and disenfranchisement became the norm for many Mexicans in the ceded territories. The human cost of this war reflects the broader dynamics of power and class. The elites who orchestrated the conflict, politicians, land speculators, and industrialists, reaped the benefits of territorial expansion. Meanwhile, the working poor, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized bore its greatest burdens, enduring the physical and social scars of a war fought largely for the interests of others. This cost, rarely acknowledged in triumphant narratives, serves as a sobering reminder of the inequities that underpinned the United States' expansionist agenda. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848, marked the official end of the Mexican-American War, yet its implications extended far beyond the cessation of hostilities. This treaty, forged under conditions of Mexican defeat, was less a mutual agreement than a coerced surrender, emblematic of the power dynamics between the two nations. Under the terms of the treaty, Mexico ceded approximately half of its territory to the United States, including what would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This vast transfer of land, known as the Mexican Cession, was unprecedented in scale, reshaping the map of North America and solidifying the United States' position as a continental power. In return, the U.S. agreed to pay Mexico $15 million, a figure that paled in comparison to the strategic and economic value of the acquired lands, and to assume $3.25 million in claims by American citizens against the Mexican government. For Mexico, the treaty represented a national humiliation. The war had devastated its economy and infrastructure, and the territorial loss stripped it of critical resources and access to the Pacific. Politically, the treaty exacerbated internal divisions, with many Mexicans viewing it as an act of betrayal by a government that had failed to defend its sovereignty. The shadow of the war and the treaty would linger, fueling resentment and shaping Mexican nationalism for generations. In the United States, the treaty was heralded by expansionists as a triumph of manifest destiny, fulfilling the vision of a coast-to-coast nation. However, the newly acquired territories intensified sectional tensions between the North and South. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in these lands became a flashpoint, accelerating the nation's march towards civil war. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and even the Civil War itself can be traced, in part, to the territorial gains solidified by the treaty. The treaty also laid bare the inequalities faced by the Mexican population that remained in the ceded territories. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had ostensibly guaranteed their property rights and citizenship, but in practice, these promises were rarely honored. Legal and extra-legal means were used to dispossess Mexicans of their land, relegating many to marginal economic and social positions within the expanding U.S. state. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was more than a diplomatic document. It was a pivotal moment that highlighted the realities of conquest and empire. While it brought immediate territorial and economic benefits to the United States, its legacies of dispossession, inequality, and political division reverberated long after the ink had dried. The legacy of the Mexican-American War, as explored in critical accounts, is one of profound contradictions and enduring consequences. On one level, it solidified the United States' position as a continental power, fulfilling the territorial aspirations of manifest destiny. The annexation of vast territories set the stage for economic growth, agricultural expansion, and increased access to global trade through Pacific ports. Yet, these apparent triumphs came at a steep human, social, and moral cost, leaving a contested and often troubling legacy. The war exemplified the use of military force as a tool for territorial acquisition under the guise of ideological justification. The rhetoric of manifest destiny framed the expansion as a moral imperative, casting the United States as a bringer of progress and civilization. However, critics, both contemporaneous and modern, have pointed to the imperialistic undertones of this narrative. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Henry David Thoreau challenged the moral legitimacy of the conflict, decrying it as an act of aggression motivated by economic gain and the expansion of slavery. Domestically, the war exacerbated existing fractures within the United States. The addition of vast new territories reignited debates over slavery, contributing to the political polarization that would culminate in the Civil War. The Compromise of 1850 and subsequent legislative battles were direct consequences of the territorial gains, demonstrating how the war's legacy extended beyond the battlefield into the very fabric of the nation's political system. For Mexico, the war and its aftermath represented a period of profound national trauma. The loss of nearly half its territory dealt a severe blow to the nation's sovereignty and economic potential. Internally, it fueled a narrative of resistance and resentment, becoming a touchstone for Mexican identity and nationalism. The effects of this territorial dispossession are still evident in the political and cultural relationship between the two nations. Critically, the war also laid bare the racial and class inequalities that underpinned the expansion. Mexican landowners in the newly acquired territories were systematically dispossessed, often through legal loopholes or outright fraud. Indigenous communities faced further marginalization as the U.S. government and settlers claimed the land they had occupied for centuries. These dynamics underscored how the benefits of expansion were concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, while the costs were borne by marginalized populations. The Mexican-American War serves as a reminder of how conquest and expansion, often celebrated in traditional narratives, can leave a legacy of division, exploitation, and inequality. By exposing these contradictions, historians challenge us to reconsider the triumphalist stories of the past and confront the complexities of the forces that have shaped modern nations. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to The Knowledge.